Colonel Pierre Baru gave the order at 3 in the morning on June 24, 1954. Move fast, no reconnaissance, 22 kilometers to Mang Yang Pass in one bound. He was racing the Viet Minh to the high ground. He thought speed would save them. By nightfall, 500 French soldiers were dead, 600 more were wounded, 800 were prisoners, 85% of their vehicles were burning wrecks. Every single artillery piece was gone, and 11 years later, American soldiers drove the exact same road, past the exact same ambush sites, ignoring every lesson the French had died to teach them. But here is what makes this worse than just another military disaster. A journalist named Bernard Fall documented the entire French catastrophe in a book called Street Without Joy, published in 1961, before the United States committed ground troops to Vietnam, before the first major battles, before 58,000 Americans died. Colin Powell later wrote that if President Kennedy or President Johnson had spent one quiet weekend reading that book, they would have come back to Washington Monday morning and immediately figured out how to get out of Vietnam. They did not read it, or they read it and did not care. And in 1967, Bernard Fall died on the same road he had warned about, killed by a Viet Minh mine on Route 1, the Street Without Joy. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why 2,000 French soldiers were destroyed in 5 days on Route Coloniale Nantin, why American commanders knew the story and drove their convoys down that same road anyway, and why the man who tried to save both armies died trying to prove his point. This is not just about one ambush, this is about institutional arrogance, the belief that your technology, your firepower, your modern army can overcome an enemy who owns the terrain and has all the time in the world. The French learned that lesson in blood. The Americans refused to learn it at all. June 7, 1954. Dien Bien Phu fell. 16,000 French soldiers surrendered after 56 days of siege in a valley surrounded by mountains. It was the worst French military defeat since the Franco-Prussian War. The Viet Minh had done the impossible. They dragged artillery up mountains that French intelligence said could not be climbed. They dug trenches that crept closer every night. They fired shells down into the valley until the French positions were obliterated. And when it was over, France was done in Indochina. But there were still French garrisons scattered across Vietnam, isolated outposts in the Central Highlands, small bases along the roads, soldiers who had been fighting for years in a war their government had already lost. And the problem was getting them out alive, because the Viet Minh were not interested in letting them leave peacefully. Every convoy, every retreat, every withdrawal was an opportunity to kill more French soldiers, to spill more blood before the Geneva Conference finalized the terms of surrender. The more French died, the stronger the Viet Minh position at the negotiating table. So they hunted. Groupon Mobile 100 was stationed at An Khe in the Central Highlands. An Khe was at the bottom of a basin, surrounded by hills, served by a small airfield. It was essentially another Dien Bien Phu waiting to happen. The garrison had been there for over a year, conducting patrols, clearing roads, reinforcing other bases under siege. But by June 1954, there was no point anymore. The war was over. The order came down from the French Chief of Staff: abandon An Khe, evacuate to Pleiku, 80 kilometers away en route Coloniale Nantin. The operation was codenamed Eglantine. GM-100 was not just any unit. It was a regimental combat team, modeled after American formations from World War II. 3,000 to 3,500 soldiers depending on configuration, self-sustaining, mobile, lethal. This particular groupement included some of the best troops France had left in Indochina, the UN Bataillon de Corée, Korean War veterans. They had fought at Chipyong-ni, at Wonju, at Heartbreak Ridge against the Chinese and North Koreans. 834 men in the 1st Korea Battalion, another 834 in the 2nd, professional, experienced, hardened, the kind of soldiers who do not break easily. The 43rd Colonial Infantry Regiment, another elite unit, the 10th Colonial Artillery, the 520th TDKQ, a light battalion from the Vietnamese National Army, support elements, engineers, medics, signal units, everything a modern mechanized force needed to move and fight. Colonel Pierre Baru commanded. He was under orders to link up with elements of GM-42 and Airborne Group 1 at Mang Yang Pass. They would escort the convoy the rest of the way to Pleiku. Simple plan: drive 22 kilometers, meet the relief force, continue another 58 kilometers to safety, 80 kilometers total. One day, maybe two. Baru made his first mistake before the convoy even left Angkor. The original plan called for a halt at kilometer 11. One company from the 43rd Colonial would conduct reconnaissance of the next 11 kilometers, check the defiles, scout the high ground, make sure the road was clear before committing the entire force to the narrow passes between kilometers 12 and 20. That stretch was a nightmare. Mountains on both sides, thick jungle, limited visibility, restricted maneuver, the kind of terrain where a defending force with patience could massacre a road-bound column. Baru threw the plan away. He moved the departure date up one day, June 24th instead of the 25th. And he ordered the column to push straight to kilometer 22 in one bound. No halt, no reconnaissance, no security, just speed. He believed he could beat the Viet Minh to Mang Yang Pass. He thought the enemy was still moving into position. He was wrong. The Viet Minh 803rd Regiment had been in place for hours, fully deployed, dug in, waiting, and Baru had just committed 2,000 men to driving straight into a killing zone. The convoy departed Angkor at 0300 hours on June 24th, 3 in the morning. Darkness. The lead elements were armor, half-tracks, M8 armored cars. Then the trucks, supply vehicles, artillery tractors, hundreds of vehicles stretched out along the narrow road. The column was kilometers long, impossible to defend in its entirety. But that is the nature of a mechanized withdrawal. You are tied to the road, you move at the speed of the slowest vehicle, and if the enemy controls the terrain on both sides, you are not in a convoy. You are in a shooting gallery. At 14:05 hours, a light reconnaissance plane reported a stone barricade in the road at kilometer 15. The pilot noted elements moving in the area, but the assessment was that these were small units. Advanced scouts maybe. Decoys. Baru did not slow down. The armored platoon picked up speed. The lead element widened the gap between itself and the headquarters company to keep pace. By 14:15, the column was stretched thin. Vehicles were separated. Communication was breaking down. And then the Viet Minh opened fire. Machine guns, bazookas, recoilless rifles, heavy mortars. All at once, the 43rd Colonial, near the front of the column, was hit first. The fire came from both sides of the road, from the hills, from the tree line, everywhere. The French tried to deploy, tried to establish a perimeter, but there was no room. The road was too narrow, the jungle too thick, vehicles blocked movement, soldiers scrambled for cover that did not exist, and the mortars kept falling. Here is a detail that will matter later. The Viet Minh mixed CS tear gas with their high explosive mortar rounds. The gas drifted through the column. French soldiers choked, could not see, could not breathe. Some tore off their gear trying to escape the gas. Others fired blindly into the smoke. It was chaos, complete loss of control. And the 803rd Regiment had done this before. They knew exactly how to break a French column. French Air Force B-26 bombers arrived, dropped ordnance on suspected Viet Minh positions. It did not help. The enemy was too close to the road, too well concealed. The bombs fell. The jungle burned, but the firing never stopped. By dusk, the Viet Minh infantry backed off slightly, gave the French a moment to breathe, to count their dead, to realize how bad it was. But the heavy mortar fire continued through the night. Men lay scattered along the roadside, moaning, bleeding. No one could reach them. The firing was too intense. By dawn on June 25th, the survivors looked at what remained. Stripped vehicles, burned out trucks, artillery pieces with their barrels pointing at the sky, useless. Bodies everywhere. Some of GM 100 had managed to break through the ambush during the night. They kept moving, kept pushing toward Mang Yang Pass, because stopping meant dying. But they had left hundreds behind, dead, wounded, captured, and they still had 55 kilometers of enemy-controlled road ahead of them. The remnants of the convoy tried to move off-road, into the jungle, away from the killing zone, but a large mechanized unit cannot move through thick jungle. The vehicles got stuck. The infantry formations broke apart. It was nearly impossible. Bernard Fall later wrote that the Viet Minh remained unbeatable in the highland regions of Vietnam, and the French could not offset the fundamental disadvantages of a road-bound army facing a hill and forest army in a country which had few roads but a great many hills and forests. That sentence is the entire story of GM 100. They were a modern mechanized force, in terrain where none of that mattered, against an enemy who moved on foot and carried everything they needed on their backs. On June 28th and 29th, the survivors reached a point 30 kilometers from Pleiku. They were almost there. The relief force was close. Safety was close. Therefore the Viet Minh hit them again. The 108th Regiment, fresh, rested, waiting at the Dak Ya Ayun Bridge. Same tactics. Mortars first, then infantry. The French took up defensive positions on both sides of the road, tried to form a perimeter, but some of the truck drivers panicked, refused to stop, pushed the vehicles in front of them into ditches, ran over wounded soldiers lying in the road. Just after noon, the Viet Minh infantry rose from the tall grass, charged, hand-to-hand fighting. Soldiers on both sides fought with bayonets, knives, rifle butts. Finally the attackers pulled back, melted into the jungle. The French survivors regrouped. They were surprised to still be alive. GM 100 reached Pleiku on June 30th. What was left of them? In 5 days of fighting, they had lost 500 dead, 600 wounded, 800 captured. 85% of their vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Every artillery piece was gone. The second group of the 10th Colonial Artillery had fought as infantry after losing all their guns. They started with 475 men. 215 made it to Pleiku. The headquarters company started with 222 men. 84 survived. The elite Korea battalions were shattered. 1st Korea Battalion went from 834 men to 452. The 2nd Korea went from 834 to 345. The 43rd Colonial Infantry lost half its strength. If this kind of deep research is something you want more of, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you do not miss the next one. But the story does not end there. On July 17th, the remnants of GM 100 were ambushed again at Chu Dre Pass. The 1st Korea Battalion, already reduced to 452 men, was hit by another Viet Minh attack. By the time it was over, 107 men remained. 3 days later, on July 20th, the Geneva Accords were signed. On August 1st, the armistice took effect. The war was over. GM 100 had been destroyed in the final days of a war that was already lost. Their deaths bought nothing, changed nothing, meant nothing except to prove that the Viet Minh could kill right up until the last minute. The destruction of Groupement Mobile 100 became a case study. Military historians analyzed it. French officers wrote reports. The lessons were documented, clear, undeniable. Do not commit mechanized forces to terrain that favors light infantry. Do not sacrifice security for speed. Do not underestimate an enemy who has been fighting in this jungle for 8 years. Do not assume your technology will save you when the enemy controls the high ground and has unlimited patience. And above all, do not tie yourself to roads in a country where roads are death traps. A French journalist named Bernard Fall was there, not at the ambush, but in Vietnam, researching, interviewing, documenting. Fall was born in Austria in 1926, moved to France, fought in the French resistance during World War II, survived, became a scholar, a war correspondent, an expert on Indochina. He first traveled to Vietnam in 1953 while researching his doctoral dissertation on the Viet Minh. He returned in 57, in 62, in 65, in 66, and finally in 67. He was obsessed with understanding this war, with explaining to the world how a modern Western army could be defeated by peasant soldiers in black pajamas. In 1961, Fall published Street Without Joy. The title came from the French soldier's nickname for a stretch of Route 1 along the Central Coast, La Rue Sans Joie, the street without joy. It was a road where convoys were ambushed so frequently that soldiers considered it a death sentence to drive it. Fall's book documented the entire French war in Indochina, the tactics, the terrain, the enemy, the mistakes. And he devoted significant attention to GM 100. He described the ambush at kilometer 15. The panic, the casualties, the final destruction. He wrote it as a warning. because by 1961, the United States was already involved in Vietnam, advisors, equipment, money, and Fall could see where it was heading. Street Without Joy was published before the United States committed ground troops, before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, before Operation Rolling Thunder, before the 1st Cavalry Division landed at An Khe. Fall wrote in plain language what would happen if America tried to fight the same war France had fought. He said it would be costly, protracted, revolutionary war fought without fronts against a mobile enemy. He said the jungle would eat American units just like it ate French units. He said the Viet Minh, now calling themselves the Viet Cong, and the North Vietnamese army had not changed. They were the same fighters, the same tactics, the same patience, and the terrain had not changed either. The book became required reading for policymakers in Washington, for officers in the Pentagon, for soldiers heading to Vietnam. Colin Powell, who served as a young advisor in Vietnam in the mid-60s and returned as a battalion commander later, wrote in his autobiography that Street Without Joy was a textbook for those of us going to Vietnam. He also wrote, years later, that if Kennedy or Johnson had read it carefully, they would have realized immediately that Vietnam was a trap. But they did not listen, or they listened and decided American soldiers were different from French soldiers. American technology was better. American tactics were superior. American will was stronger. They were wrong on all counts. August 1965. The 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile arrived in Vietnam. This was the new face of American warfare. Helicopters, air mobility, the ability to move infantry rapidly without being tied to roads. The division established its main base at An Khe, the exact location where GM-100 had been garrisoned 11 years earlier, the exact place where Baru gave the order to move fast and sacrifice security. The Americans built Camp Radcliffe, massive, modern, fortified, and Route Colonial 19, now called Highway 19 or QL-19, became their main supply route from the coast at Quai Nho through An Khe and Mang Yang Pass to Pleiku. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore commanded 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, one of the most storied units in the American Army, Custer's Regiment. Moore was a professional, a student of military history, and when he flew over Route 19 in a UH-1 helicopter in August 1965, he recognized the terrain immediately. He had studied the French experience. He knew the story of GM-100. He looked down at the same road, the same mountains, the same jungle, and he saw the French graves, 1,800 of them, north of Mang Yang Pass, rows and rows of white markers. French Foreign Legion soldiers, mostly Germans who had joined after World War II because they had no homes to return to. They died on Route 19 in 1954, and their graves were still there, visible from the air. A reminder. Moore later wrote that death is the price you pay for underestimating this tenacious enemy. He was determined not to repeat French mistakes. In November 1965, he led his battalion into the Ia Drang Valley, the first major battle between American and North Vietnamese forces. Landing Zone X-ray. Moore's battalion was surrounded, outnumbered, under attack from 3 sides. But Moore had studied Dien Bien Phu. He knew what happened when you let the enemy mass fires on you from the high ground. He called in everything: artillery, airstrikes, helicopter gunships, aerial rockets. The firepower was overwhelming. His battalion took heavy casualties, 79 killed, 121 wounded, but the North Vietnamese lost more than 600. Moore held the landing zone. He won because he respected the enemy and he did not underestimate them. But Moore was the exception. Most American commanders did not study the French experience, or they studied it and dismissed it. They believed helicopters changed everything. That air mobility meant they would never be tied to roads like the French, but they still needed to supply Pleiku and Camp Radcliffe and all the fire bases in between. And that meant convoys. Hundreds of trucks driving Route 19 every day, through An Khe Pass, through Mang Yang Pass, past the same ambush sites where GM-100 died, and the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army attacked those convoys constantly. American soldiers who served along Route 19 remember it. They built fire bases to protect the road. LZ Shula, LZ Action, Bridge 27. Small outposts with a few dozen men, 100% alert all night. Patrols during the day, clearing the hilltops overlooking the pass. Setting ambushes at night to catch VC sappers. It was endless. The enemy never stopped probing, never stopped attacking. Mines, snipers, mortars, ambushes. A veteran later wrote that it was a never-ending mission to protect the convoys from Quai Nam via the An Khe Pass and the Mang Yang Pass up to Pleiku. Another wrote about being ambushed several times while making runs at first light from Bridge 27 to Camp Radcliffe to open the road for the day. They could see the French wrecks, rusted hulks of vehicles from 1954 still lying in the jungle on the south side of the road. One helicopter pilot photographed them from the air in the late 60s. The trees around them had been defoliated with Agent Orange to deny the enemy cover, but the vehicles were still there. Testimony to what happened when you underestimated this enemy on this terrain. And the graves were still there too. 1,800 white markers visible from the mountaintop overlooking Mang Yang Pass. One American advisor in 1971 wrote that his Montagnard counterpart spoke German, learned it from the old French soldiers who survived. The ghosts were everywhere. Here is what the Americans knew. They knew the French had been destroyed on Route 19. They knew GM 100 lost 85% of its strength in 5 days. They knew Bernard Fall had documented it. They knew Colin Powell called it a textbook. They knew Hal Moore studied it and survived because he respected the lessons. They knew the graves were there, the wrecks were there, the ambush sites were the same, and they drove convoys down that road anyway. For 6 years, from 1965 to 1971, thousands of trucks, hundreds of soldiers, and the enemy killed them the same way they killed the French. Mines, ambushes, mortars, patience. In February 1967, Bernard Fall returned to Vietnam for the last time. He had written Street Without Joy. He had written Hell in a Very Small Place about Dien Bien Phu. He had written countless articles warning America, pleading with policymakers to read the history, to learn from French mistakes, to understand that this war could not be won with firepower and technology. But no one listened, or they listened and did not care. So Fall went back to document, to witness, to try one more time to make people understand. On February 21, 1967, Bernard Fall was on patrol with a Marine unit near Hue. They were walking along Route 1, the original Street Without Joy, the road he had named in his book, the road French soldiers had died on by the hundreds. Fall was 40 years old. He was carrying a tape recorder, documenting everything, asking questions, taking notes, and then he stepped on a mine. The explosion killed him instantly. Also killed a Marine photographer named Gunnery Sergeant Byron Hyland. Fall's last words were recorded on the tape. "We have hit a mine. Oh my God." Then silence. The man who tried to warn 2 armies died on the road he warned them about. Killed by the same enemy he had studied for 14 years, using the same tactic the Viet Minh had used since 1946. A mine on a road. Simple, effective, impossible to stop without controlling the terrain. And America did not control the terrain any more than France had. Colin Powell wrote his reflection decades later. After the war, after 58,000 Americans died, after Vietnam fell to the North in 1975, after all the arguments about tactics and strategy and politics, Powell said if Kennedy or Johnson had read Street Without Joy carefully, they would have come back to Washington and figured out how to get out. But they did not, and the soldiers paid the price, just like the French soldiers paid the price. On the same roads, against the same enemy, making the same mistakes. The movie We Were Soldiers, released in 2002, opens with a recreation of the GM 100 ambush. Mel Gibson plays Hal Moore. The opening scene shows French soldiers being slaughtered at Mang Yang Pass, mortars falling, soldiers screaming, the jungle on fire. Then it cuts to Moore studying the battle, learning, preparing. The movie is about Ia Drang, about Moore's refusal to repeat French mistakes. But the filmmakers understood that you could not tell the American story without showing the French story first, because they were the same story. The only difference was that Moore listened to the warnings and most American commanders did not. Route 19 is still there. You can drive it today. From Quy Nhon on the coast, through An Khe and Mang Yang Pass to Pleiku, it has been widened, paved, improved, but the mountains are the same. The jungle is the same. The choke points are the same. And if you know where to look, you can still see the French graves north of the pass. 1,800 men who died 11 years before the first American soldier set foot in An Khe. They are a monument, not to French failure, to the arrogance of believing that your army is different, that your technology is better, that your tactics will succeed where others failed. The French thought they could hold Indochina with superior firepower. They were wrong. The Americans thought they could win Vietnam with helicopters and B-52s. They were wrong too. And the soldiers who died on Route 19 in 1954, and again between 1965 and 71, deserved leaders who were willing to learn from the past instead of repeating it. Bernard Fall understood this. He spent his life trying to explain it. He wrote with clarity and honesty and fury that the war in Vietnam was not winnable the way France and America were trying to win it. That you cannot fight ideology with technology, that you cannot defeat an insurgency by killing insurgents faster than they can recruit, that you cannot hold ground in a country where the population does not want you there and the terrain favors the defender. He was right, and he died proving it. On a road called Street Without Joy, stepping on a mine placed by an enemy he respected and understood better than his own government did. GM 100 was destroyed because Colonel Bauru chose speed over security, because he underestimated the Viet Minh, because he thought he could race them to Mang Yang Pass and win. The American convoys on Route 19 were hit again and again because American commanders chose logistics over lessons, because they needed to supply Pleiku and they only had one road, because they thought helicopters and firepower would protect them. The French lost 500 men in 5 days. The Americans lost thousands over 6 years. Different armies, different decades, same road, same enemy, same result. But if you want to understand how helicopter warfare evolved from the lessons of Route 19 and why the Ia Drang Valley became the battle that defined American tactics for the rest of the war, that story is one I have covered in detail right here.